invited by the Muslim Student Association and by the World Islamic Center. The last time I spoke there, somehow the lighting was perfect. So all the pictures of me online is the only good one. So if I were for the press, I'm getting old, I went with that picture. And, but because George Mason is so crucial for my ego now, you can't, I didn't want to, I mean, it wasn't my idea to sell books here. It's just like publishers and the students actually had this idea. But if no one buys them, then I'll really be devastated. So even if you don't buy them, like, just take a few copies, put them aside until after I leave, and bring them out. I can't handle it. Yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me. The good thing, well, the unfortunate good thing about studying Islam and Islamic law is that it's always in the news. Unfortunately, it's always in the news in the United States for bad reasons. And just a couple of days ago, I woke up in the morning, lo and behold, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the well-known expert on Islam, who doesn't know anything about Islam, except for the fact that she happened to be born Muslim, had written a new book entitled Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. I thought this was an improvement because her previous book was called Infidel, and Infidel is actually worse than Heretic, so I thought maybe she's trying to improve her standing amongst Muslims. But anyway, I looked at some reviews of the book, and as usual, there's all sorts of mischaracterizations of Sharia. So I thought, what better prompt to discuss a topic that I find so interesting, and that I love teaching about and talking about, namely Sharia. And that is important, probably, when you talk about misquoting Muhammad or misrepresenting Islam, one of the ways in which it's most regularly and often misrepresented is through people not properly understanding the tradition of Sharia. So that's what I'll discuss today. The first question is, what is the Sharia? Sharia in Arabic originally meant the path to the watering hole in the desert, or the path of a tribe, the way of a tribe, the custom of a tribe. In Islam, it becomes the way of the Muslim, tribe. And it's best understood probably as the notion of God's law, as the idea of God's law. And it's important you think about it as the idea of God's law, because its manifestation, like all ideas, its manifestation in life is not the same as the idea. So ideas exist in the mind. They don't exist in reality. And when you take something that exists as an ideal and you make it real in the world, you get different representations of that idea. And that's what we see in the case of the Sharia tradition in Islam. It's a tradition of tremendous diversity. And I'll use the word tradition, Sharia tradition, because that's probably the best way for people in the United States to think about it. If you think about American law, which is based on the British common law, there is no one American law. You can't just go and say, you can't go to the library and say, I'd like to check out the American law book. No, you don't. You can go and you can find the law codes of 50 different states, and you can check those books out. But even those don't represent the laws of each state. These represent the statutes passed by the legislatures of those states. There's also the law that's just the judge-made law, the law that judges manifest and represent, namely the actual common law. So even American law, it doesn't exist as one thing. It exists as a tradition, as a legacy that's passed on and manifested here and there in different ways. Everybody knows what you're talking about when you mention it, but even if you can't go and point to one thing, it is American law. So I'll refer a lot tonight to the idea of the Sharia law tradition, or the Sharia tradition. The Sharia is tremendously diverse for a number of reasons. One, because it's based on sources, the authenticity of which are disputed. The authenticity of which is disputed. What does that mean? To put it very simply, and this is something you could talk about for a long time, to sum it up, the Sharia is based on several sources. Two of them are believed by Muslims to be revealed sources. So they come from God. The first one is the Quran, the actual revealed word of God in Arabic to the Prophet Muhammad between 610 and 632 when he died, year 632 of the Common Era. The Quran is a very small book. Many Muslims memorize the whole thing, word for word. It's not that small, okay, but it's not like the Bible. It's like a fourth the size of the Bible, or fourth the size of the New Testament, I think. So you can, but it's a challenge to memorize the whole thing, don't get me wrong. But the Quran is not really a book of law. In fact, most Islamic law, most of the details of the Sharia don't come from the Quran. They come from what's called the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. The Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad is his authoritative precedent. It's his living explanation of the teachings of the Quran. It explains the Quran, it adds to the Quran, sometimes it modifies Quranic rulings. So the Quran tells people how to pray. It tells people to pray. It tells Muslims that they should pray. It doesn't tell them how many times they should pray. It doesn't tell them how to pray. It doesn't tell them what to do if you make a mistake in the prayer. Right? This stuff all is taught by the Prophet. Now, Muslims don't dispute the authenticity of the Quran. It's agreed upon, its text is agreed upon by all Muslims. It has been since around the year 650 of the Common Era. They do, however, disagree on what constitutes the Sunnah of the Prophet. Because unlike the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet is not written down early on. It's transmitted sometimes in kind of primitive written form. It's transmitted orally. It's transmitted through custom and tradition. And it really remains to this day a body of knowledge that is between oral and written form, between written books describing what the Prophet said or did on a certain occasion, the way he ruled in a certain case that was presented to him. And it's also lived in the practice of the Muslim community and in the problem-solving methods of Muslim scholars, as it has always been. So, because the Sunnah is much more amorphous than the Quran, parts of it are disputed by some Muslims and parts of it are disputed by others. So some Muslims would believe that the Prophet, let's say, said that all deeds are determined by intentions. Deeds are determined by intentions, so by your intentions. So Muslims who believe that the Prophet said this, and believe that's an authentic report from him, would believe that if you don't have the intention of making ablutions before prayer, your prayer is invalid because your ablutions aren't valid. Whereas Muslims who don't believe that saying of the Prophet is authoritative or authentic would not consider intentions to be essential for doing ablutions before your prayer. So there's diversity in the Sharia tradition from the beginning because there's disagreement over some of its constitutive sources. Finally, the third overall, this is a big source, is just human reason. And when I mean human reason, I don't mean necessarily logic or what somebody thinks is reasonable. Reason is just the activity of the human mind. Whether it's the activity of the human mind set to interpreting the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet, whether it's specific rational tools that Muslim scholars develop, like analogical reasoning. So if you say that, just to be really detailed, right? If you say that human blood is, once it leaves the body, it becomes ritually impure. So if you get blood on you, it's like ritually unclean, or like even animal blood. You have to wash that off in a specific way. Okay? Well, what about other bodily fluids? What about, for example, breast milk? Is breast milk ritually impure? And this comes into the issue of can a woman buy and sell breast milk? Let's say you're nursing a child, you're not producing enough breast milk. In theory, you can't buy things that are ritually unclean. So, by analogy, if you think of breast milk as a bodily fluid like blood, then breast milk would be ritually impure, and you couldn't buy it and sell it. But you're going to have a lot of problems with women who don't have enough breast milk to feed their child, and back then they didn't have formula. So scholars use another rational tool, which is called istihsan in Arabic. In English, it's best understood as equitable reasoning, which is, you can see that this analogy is leaving you with a kind of unjust result. So you you find another way to get to a just ruling. In this case, they would say necessity requires that people be able to get breast milk for their babies, otherwise their babies are going to die. And so in that case, you would say necessity makes this then permissible. So these are some of the different kind of rational tools that Muslim scholars use in deriving the rulings that make up Islamic law. As an example of the diversity caused by interpretation, you can take the case of how, this comes up in the news a lot, how Islamic legal scholars viewed places of worship of non-Muslims living under Muslim rule. So churches and synagogues of Jews and Christians, or temples of Hindus and Buddhists living under Muslim rule. One method of interpreting, let's say, a verse from the Quran, treats it as an exclusive text. So the Quran talks about Jews, Christians, a group called the Sabians, no one really knows who they are. Okay. It talks about these groups as people who perceive revelation before Islam. Groups who have, although their religion has been, from the Muslim perspective, corrupted, their religion is based on revelation from God. So Jews, Christians, and this group called the Sabians. Now, if you believe that when the Quran mentions these groups, that's all the groups that could have this status, that's one approach to the text. So you can imagine if I say, bring me an egg salad sandwich, tuna salad sandwich, and a brownie. From this perspective, it would mean, do not bring me any pieces of fruit or one of those oatmeal cookies and no drink. The other perspective would be, the other interpretive approach would be, if I say, bring me an egg salad sandwich, a tuna salad sandwich, and a brownie, I might also want a oatmeal cookie and a drink and some fruit. And we should be open to that possibility. So the majority of Muslim scholars understood that Quranic list of these groups that were legitimate religions who could practice and retain their religion under Muslim rule. They thought that this list is not exhaustive, that it's just a listing of a few groups, and any other group you come across, like Hindus and Buddhists and Zoroastrians, they're also allowed to continue to practice their religion under Muslim rule. And this is the majority opinion of Muslim scholars. The other approach, which was the minority, would say, no, this is an exclusive group. So if you come across Hindus or Zoroastrians, they don't meet that criteria. Similarly, what about repairing or building churches or synagogues? So if you're, let's say, the Muslim rulers of Baghdad in the 1000s, and there's lots of synagogues and churches in Baghdad, what happens if the Jewish community wants to build a new synagogue or wants to repair an existing synagogue? One approach to reading the Quranic text says, the Quran mentions that if God did not use one group of people to oppose another group of people, then many synagogues, monasteries, and churches and mosques where the name of God is mentioned would be destroyed. So it talks about synagogues, churches, monasteries, and mosques as being places, all being places where God's name is mentioned, and this is a good thing. So from that perspective, you would say, even if as a Muslim you don't agree with Christianity, you don't agree with Judaism, you don't agree with Zoroastrianism, the people in those churches and mosques and synagogues and fire temples are honoring God in whatever way they believe subjectively to be the correct way, and that's something that's inherently good, and therefore it should be promoted. So they can build new mosques, new temples or new synagogues, or repair existing ones. The other perspective would not look at that angle, would say, wait a second, these other religions are engaging in practices that Muslims find religiously unacceptable, and therefore it's wrong for us to sanction those practices by allowing them to rebuild, or build new places of worship. And you can see it's not that these two approaches they're both reading the same sacred scriptures, but they're coming at it with different assumptions. One assumption is sort of honoring the subjective worship of God, and the other one is concerned with not allowing practices and beliefs that Muslims don't agree with. Finally, a very important cause of diversity in the Sharia tradition is the tremendous geographic diversity of Islamic civilization. So Muslims, within 100 years or 150 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, Muslims are in 711 they enter the Iberian Peninsula. The same year they also begin the conquest of India. In 750 they reach Inner Central Asia. And over the next centuries, Islam as a religion and Muslims as a community spread through Southeast Asia, China, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, and then in the 20th century to Europe and to the United States. So Muslims live and follow the Sharia in a tremendous diversity of geographic locales, different cultures where there's different customs, or people have different needs. So the Sharia is constantly adapting to these local situations, and you get also tremendous diversity. So a good example of this would be in one of the Sunni schools of law, the Hanafi school, which is the most numerically numerous, largest school of law in terms of followers, which is almost all the Muslims in South Asia are Hanafis. Now, in the Hanafi school of law, you cannot eat anything that comes out of the water, any sea creature, except fish. Except fish. Now, is anybody here from Bangladesh originally? Oh, Bangladesh, okay. Yesterday I gave a talk at SUNY Stony Brook, and almost the entire audience was Bangladeshi, so unfortunately, clearly we have a different representation here. Bangladesh is a country that's just surrounded by water inside and outside. And Bengali Muslims eat lots of things that aren't fish that come out of the water, even though they're technically Hanafi Muslims, because that ruling just wasn't going to last. It wasn't meeting the standards of the needs of Muslims in that community. Similarly, Muslims today in Europe and the United States are theoretically, ideally in Islamic law, Muslim men and women would not shake hands with people of the opposite gender. But because this is culturally essential in Europe and America, Muslim scholars and scholarly institutions in Western Europe and North America have generally said it is permissible for Muslims to shake hands with people from the opposite gender, because this is a part of local culture. There are certain aspects of Islamic law that are not going to adjust to local culture, because they're very specifically stated in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet. For example, alcohol is prohibited. Alcohol is prohibited in the Quran. So you're never going to go to a place, let's say you come to an American university where students love to drink and it's part of the culture. Or you go to Boston and you live next to an Irish pub and you feel it's part of local culture to drink beer. That doesn't matter. That's never going to overcome the textual prohibition on drinking alcohol. So there's certain fixed points in Islamic law that are never going to change, but a lot of the details of the contact surfaces of where that law and life meet, they will change based on local needs and local cultures. So the tremendous diversity of the Sharia leads to numerous schools of law forming in the early Islamic period. And these schools of law some of them become extinct, some of them don't become very popular for a variety of reasons. And basically by the 1100s or 1200s of the Common Era, in Sunni Islam you have 4 schools that survive. In Shiite Islam you have 2 schools that survive. You also have the Ibadi school, which is found only in Oman and parts of Algeria, which is another sect of Islam. But so these schools have tremendous internal diversity, both within each school, but also amongst themselves. So you have, when anyone says the sentence Islamic law or Sharia says X, that sentence is almost always automatically incorrect. Because there is almost always more than one opinion on Islamic law, more than one ruling from Islamic law on any issue you can imagine. From how you pray, to whether or not you can eat certain foods, to whether or not you can engage in certain kind of financial transactions. There's always more than one opinion. And so I think, again, American law is kind of a useful analog, because we all understand that American law is one unified tradition. But if someone asks you, let's say there's a tree growing in my neighbor's yard, and it's dropping these stinky berries onto my house and onto my yard, and the roots of the tree are going under my deck and pushing up the stones, what can I do? What's my legal remedy? And if you ask a lawyer, what they'll tell you is, it depends on which jurisdiction you're in. It depends which state you're in. The rules in Virginia are very different than the rules in Hawaii, very different than the rules in Maryland. Some states allow you to go and chop that part of the tree down. Some states say if the tree is harming your property, you can do something about it. Some states say, no, a living thing, if it's naturally occurring, you can't do anything about it. So we know that there's tremendous diversity in the actual rules of American law. But we think of it, we understand it as being one unified tradition. That's the same way with Sharia. Perhaps the most important, I didn't put this first, perhaps the most important distinction that to keep in mind when you're thinking about the Sharia as opposed to, let's say, Western law or American law, is that the bulk of the Sharia, the bulk of its rulings, subjects that are dealt with under the Sharia, will never see the inside of the courtroom. They are not things that people actually, we would think of as law, as disputes between people. They involve things like ritual purity, performing ablutions for prayer, fasting, pilgrimage to Mecca, giving charity, manners, treatment of your relatives, how you dress, how you sleep, how you eat. So these are all things that in the United States we would consider either ethics, personal ethics and conduct, or matters of personal religious practice. But if you take a book where a Muslim scholar has actually tried to set out what their vision of the Sharia is, Islamic law is, if you have a book, let's say 12 volumes, which is not an unusual size book for Islamic law, 12 volumes. Probably the first two volumes are going to be ablution and prayer. Then you're going to have a whole volume on fasting, a whole volume on pilgrimage, a whole volume on marriage and divorce, and a volume or two on sales transactions, irrigation of fields, business partnerships, lending, mortgages, everything you can imagine. And then you'll have a volume on personal behavior, on laws of war, things like that. And actually, only a few of these subjects are things that would actually, you would take to a court, to a Muslim court. Most of it is stuff that is never going to, a judge wouldn't even know what to say. You go to a judge and say, I am taking myself to court because I don't think I'm praying again. That's ridiculous. No, these things are never going to go before a judge. But it doesn't mean that they're not in the most important areas of Islamic law. So here you have to think of Muslim scholars who in many ways are equivalent to, it's actually kind of ironic, but they're like rabbis. They're not, Muslim scholars, the clerical class of Muslims, are not akin to priests in the sense that they don't perform sacraments, they don't perform a mediating role between man and God. They're like rabbis, in that their primary job is to study the sacred scriptures of their religion and to guide the Muslim community, guide their followers, their flocks, towards a proper understanding of God's will. They don't have formal process of ordination. You become a Muslim scholar when you are viewed as a scholar by those around you. But these scholars can and have historically served in two very important capacities. One is as a judge, sitting in a court where they'll actually be doing things like applying laws of contract, and people coming and getting disputes over buying and selling things, over land. And the other thing is to the role of muftis. And a mufti is a Muslim scholar who is just giving, mufti is a Muslim scholar who's just giving his opinion on a matter of Islamic law to a Muslim. And it's a non-binding opinion. And this is where you get things like Muslim scholars talking about prayer and fasting. So if I say, I I have an ulcer in my stomach. If I fast from sunrise to sunset during Ramadan, especially in the summer, I'm in agony all day. Do I have to fast? That's not a legal issue in the sense that that's nothing that's going to go into a court. But that is a legal issue in the sense that it is part of God's law. And so I would go to a mufti and ask that mufti what his or her opinion is on that issue. And the more respected the mufti, the more learned the mufti, the more compelling their opinion is going to be. But mufti's opinions and their authority is given to them by people's respect for them. There's no official way that they can demand or allegiance. Of course, the thing that comes to people's mind in the United States first, and perhaps the only thing that comes to their mind when you talk about the Sharia, is people getting stoned, people getting their hands cut off. So, I want to turn attention to this issue. These are called the Hudud. Hudud means, this word in Arabic means the boundaries of God, the limits of God. The Hudud are the boundaries of God. And I'll explain what that means in a second. It's important to keep in mind, however, that if you imagine that big 12-volume book of Islamic law that I was talking about earlier, only maybe half a volume of that is going to be on the Hudud. So it's a very small part, a very small share of Islamic legal discourse. In order to understand how Hudud functions, what their function is historically, not only historically in Muslim practice, but in actually the imagination or the envisioning of Islamic law in the original scriptures of Islam, you have to think about the difference between what Muslims term the rights of man and the rights of God. So, when I have a contract with, what's your name? Bilal. When I have a contract with Bilal, and I break my contract, or when what's your name? Musira. When I run over Musira's foot with my car, okay? Or when I say that, what's your name? Samir is, living in my basement and won't leave, even though he doesn't own it. Okay? But these are all rights of man, rights of mankind. Someone is being wronged or claims that they've been wronged by another person. So the law seeks to rectify this problem, to remove the harm from the person who's been harmed and somehow to pay them back for what's been done to them. That is the majority of Islamic law and sort of the things that are in courts is rights of man, rights of mankind. The hudud are the rights of God. These are certain offenses that are mentioned in the Quran, and some of them mentioned in the reports of the Prophet, most of them in the Quran, as being things that offend the rights of God. And it's interesting, a lot of these things they don't obviously hurt other people. So, for example, what are the hudud? Apostasy is one of the hudud. So if a Muslim abandons their religion. Fornication or adultery is one of the hudud. Slander, especially sexual slander, is one of the hudud. Drinking an intoxicant or getting drunk, getting intoxicated is one of the hudud. Certain kinds of theft is one of the hudud. Not all theft, because, as we'll discuss, it has to be certain kinds of theft. This is one of the hudud. So, some of these things, like, if I sit at home and I get a giant 40 of malt liquor, and I drink the entire thing and just pass out in my armchair, I haven't hurt anybody. But that has offended God. That is an offense against God. Similarly, if someone fornicates, and no one even sees them do it, that's still an offense against God. So it's not, and notice that murder is not one of the hudud. So just because something is a hudud crime doesn't mean that it has a really high, what we would consider social cost. So we would think murder has a really high social cost. Getting drunk in your basement when no one's seeing you does not have a very high social cost. But the latter is a hudud crime, the former is not. Because it's important. It's not about the seriousness of the crime, it's about the seriousness of the crime in God's eyes. this distinction between the rights of man and the rights of God is very important, because one of the commands that the Prophet Muhammad gave to his followers about dealing with crimes is that he said, "Udru al-Hudud bi-shubahat." Ward off the Hudud crimes by any ambiguity or doubt you can find. فَإِنْ وَجَدْتَ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا فَخَلِّ عَنْهُ السَّبِيلَ. If you find a way out for the person, the accused person, let them go. For it is better for the judge to err on the side of mercy than to err on the side of severity. So this is a command from the Prophet to Muslims. And Muslim judges, from the very beginning of Islam, took this extremely seriously. To the point that the Quran says, if the thief, male or female thief, if they are caught, cut their hand off as a punishment for what they did. That seems very clear. Anybody who steals anything would have their hand cut off. Now you see the way, however, the way the Sunnah, the Prophet functions to adjust the Quran. The Prophet says that the thing stolen has to be above a certain value. It has to be something that was put in a protected place. It can't be a foodstuff or a piece of food or fruit. So if I leave out my phone right here and someone comes and steals it, that is a crime of theft, but it's not a Hudud crime of theft. If I have a really cheap phone and I even hide it under the desk and I don't want anyone to take it, and someone comes and steals it, it's not going to be a Hudud crime because it's too cheap. If I have my big, foot-long Subway sandwich that I've been wanting to eat all day, dearly, and I put it under here so no one else will take it, and someone comes and takes it, it's not going to be a Hudud crime because it's a foodstuff. Similarly, what are the types of ambiguities that judges accepted? If within theft, in the case of theft, and this was actually practiced during the Prophet's own lifetime, the judge would ask the accused thief, "Did you steal this thing?" And if the thief denied it, even if the thief's holding the thing in his hands, if he denied it or she denied it, this was not considered to be a Hudud crime. I'll talk in the next slide about how you deal with theft that's not a Hudud crime. It's important to keep in mind that this is a duty that Muslim scholars and as judges believe they had to fulfill. This is a duty they believe they had to fulfill. And there's a wonderful story that, hang on a second, what time did I start talking? I think I started after the time. Half an hour ago? Okay. There's a wonderful story in the late 1400s in Cairo. There's a couple is caught fornicating. They're caught together and they admit to fornicating. And so they're going to be, the Hudud punishment for fornication is either lashing, under lashing, or getting stoned, depending if you're married or not. And they're going to be punished because they confessed. The couple then withdraws their confession. And the judge says, okay, they can no longer be punished in a severe manner. They can be lectured or given a talking to, or put in prison for a few days. The ruler of Egypt didn't like the guy who was caught, and so he said, "No, I want this guy executed." The chief judge of Cairo, the scholar was certainly the chief judge, said, "Whoever executes this man will be executed or should be executed for the crime of murder." So what he's saying to the ruler is, if you execute this man, you in turn should be executed. The Sultan got so mad at him because the judge refused to carry out the ruling that he exiled him to Gaza. And he lost his job and his career, everything, and he was driven from his home, this judge, because he considered it his duty to ward off the Hudud crimes by any ambiguity possible. In this case, the people had withdrawn their confession. He could no longer, as he understood the application of Islamic law, he could no longer punish them. So the question is, why do you have these very harsh laws, like why does the Quran say cut the hand of the thief off? Why does the Quran talk about lashing the adulterer or the fornicator? Why does this, if the job of the judge is to try and get people out of these crimes. Here we have to keep in mind that law isn't just about resolving disputes. Law is also a teacher. Law is also a statement about what our values are, what people's values are, how they want their society to be. And in the case of these hudud offenses, these are things that the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, the precedent of the Prophet, want to make clear that Muslims understand are severe sins in the eyes of God. These are severe sins in the eyes of God. Note, some of them are not actually crimes that really affect other people, but they're severe sins in the eyes of God. And if you, prior to the late 1800s, when you get formal police forces and things like the telegraph and good systems of filing, and then electricity, and modern bureaucracies, and modern court systems, and transport, and you can actually have an efficient police service. Prior to that, legal systems are generally characterized by extremely harsh punishments. So in 1820, the year 1820, in England, guess how many death penalty offenses there were in English law? Anyone have a guess? Death penalty offenses, 1820. There were 200 death penalty offenses in 1820 in England, including stealing firewood, poaching fish from someone's fish pond, taking their shoe buckles when they're drunk. These were all death penalty offenses. Do you think people were actually put to death for these crimes? Definitely not. If someone was actually caught, there would be the judge would find some procedural irregularity to punish them for a lesser offense. The purpose is, if you don't have police who can go out there and just sit on the road because you don't have that much money to hire policemen who can sit out and prevent crimes, if you're trusting people to police themselves, the way you do that is by scaring the heck out of them. You terrify them with severe punishments in the hope that this will deter them. Okay, so let's look actually then how a Sharia court would function. And this is again, I stress the tremendous diversity of Islamic history and Islamic civilization. So the way a Sharia court functions in Morocco in the 1200s is different from the way a court functions in Indonesia or Aceh in the 1800s, or Saudi Arabia today, or Istanbul in the 1800s. But these are general features that might take on specific considerations. You'll see that the blue things are rules that are set in one way or the other by the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, although a lot of their details are going to be determined by scholarly interpretation. But the kind of meat, the basis for the rules is set in the Quran and Sunnah. The yellow is solely the discretion of the judge. And that is called ta'zir in Arabic. Ta'zir is discretionary punishment. So you see up at the top the hudud. The hudud laws are effective in theory, but what happens? The evidentiary standards are so high, they're so high that they are almost never carried out. To the extent that, so for Ottoman Istanbul, the Ottomans occupied Istanbul in 1453. For the duration of the Ottoman Empire until it fell in 1924, do you know how many people were stoned for fornication, for adultery in Ottoman Istanbul? That's almost 500 years. Any guesses? One person. There was a lot of fornication, obviously. And just interesting fact, there's lots of prostitution, like all places. There was lots of prostitution in the Ottoman Empire, in Ottoman Istanbul. Prostitutes got caught with their customers. Weren't they engaging in fornication? Shouldn't they be punished? No, because what is prostitution? It's somebody paying money for sex. What is marriage, at least in its legal dimension, in Islam? The husband pays the wife a dowry, and in return they are married, and sex becomes legal. So Muslim scholars said, that is an ambiguity. It's a sufficient ambiguity to say that this has some slight relation to marriage, and therefore we can't punish this as fornication. What you can do is you can yell at the prostitute, you can yell at the John, you tell the John he has to carry firewood all night until the morning prayer, you can kick the prostitute out of the neighborhood. But people were not punished for fornication by the hudud laws for prostitution. The second, here you have hudud. So what happens is, because the evidentiary requirements for hudud are so high, anything that is a case of theft automatically isn't a hudud crime of theft. It becomes what's called ghasb, or usurpation, or we call it in American law conversion of property. So if I catch Masira, wow, good job. I catch her, I actually see her walking out with my computer. And she even has like one of like a little like thief mask on, like when I was a kid on Sesame Street, you know, like black outfit and a mask on. So I know she's a thief. I see her do that. She gets caught with my computer. If she doesn't confess, which she doesn't have to do, automatically this is just dealt with as a crime of usurpation. She owes me either, she has to replace my item, give it back to me, or if it's damaged, she has to replace the value of the item at the time it was stolen. Very simple. And that's how the majority of these cases of theft are dealt with, the vast majority. The other thing you see up here is qisas. Qisas is mandated, the details of it are set in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, and this is retaliatory punishment. This in American law we call tort law, and also murder, fall under this. This is personal injury. So I go up to Bilal, and wait, whose foot did I run over? Yours. Didn't I run your foot over? Or yours? Syria, again, I'm sorry, you're getting punished here. I ran your foot over with my car. I owe you, even if it's not intentional, I owe you the value of your injured foot. Okay. If I hit Bilal with a baseball bat, I owe him that value of that injury. If I kill Bilal, then if it's unintentional, my family, or if I don't have a family, the state, will pay his family, compensation money. If I kill him intentionally, then the Quran says either his family, or if he doesn't have any family, the judge, the state, can either have me executed, take the compensation money, or forgive me entirely. These are the options we have. And what happens is, for the most part, in practice, in Islamic history, everything is dealt with through compensation payment. So if you remember, anyone remembers a couple years ago when that American CIA contractor in Pakistan, Raymond Davis, I think his name was, killed 3 people, or killed 2 people, and another person was killed in Pakistan. How was he eventually let off and turned in? Because I think it was Saudi Arabia actually paid the compensation money to his family. To the right of qisas you have, and the size of these rectangles is not incidental. A huge, huge portion of the cases that went before Muslim judges dealt with inheritance issues. And inheritance, the rules of inheritance are specified in the Quran, Sunnah of the Prophet, and then details added by Muslim scholars. To the right of, over here, of Tajir, you have what's called mu'amalat. Mu'amalat are transactions, contracts, buying, selling, renting, business partnerships, gifts, use of property, sharecropping, anything you can imagine, irrigation agreements. All of this go under mu'amalat. And these are all things that are judged, the rules of this are set in the Quran and the Sunnah, and the details provided by scholars. But also, it can be influenced by ta'zir. So let's say I break a contract with Bilal. In theory, I owe him the damages due for me breaking this contract. He went out and bought a bunch of bunnies, rabbits that we were going to sell to the zoo. I say, I'm no longer going to, do this business with you. Now he's stuck with all these bunnies and I have to pay him some damage. Okay? But let's say I'm also a real jerk. I'm a liar, I'm disrespectful, I do shady dealings all the time. The judge can up the punishment based on his own discretion. And the limit in the majority of Muslim schools of law, the limit for discretionary punishment, you could charge people fines up to a certain amount, you could put them in prison up to a certain amount of time, or you could lash them up to 10 lashes. That's the maximum you can do for the majority of Muslim scholars. Finally, over on the far right, the thing that took up the most space in the Muslim judge's docket was marriage, divorce, family law issues. This was the topic that most came before Muslim judges. And the details of marriage law and divorce law are set in the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, and then lots of details, lots of interpretation provided by Muslim scholars. Another interesting, why is that not here? Okay, sorry. Another interesting feature of the Islamic legal system is that Muslim scholars, by the early 700s, so within, by the early, late 700s, so within about a century and a half of the Prophet's death, the Muslims adopt a custom that was prevalent in the Near East and Middle East before Islam, which is the notion that the ruler is the ultimate guarantor of justice. The ruler is the ultimate guarantor of justice. And what this provides in Muslims is something that they call the madhalim. Madhalim means wrongs. Wrongs, like someone has been wronged. This is an exact equivalent in English and American legal system of what's called equity courts. In American England, after the early 20th century, these are joined together. But in American law, we still have equity law and common law right next to each other. And sometimes just judges use both of them at the same time. These are two different, this is a totally different body of law than the Sharia. This is based on, why would someone go to equity court? One, if a government official has wronged you. Someone who's too powerful to get taken to court. Two, if a judge has wronged you. This is where you go for appeals. I was in a court and the judge I don't think was fair. I would go to the madhalim or equity court. Sometimes the rules, the procedures of Sharia court were very strict. So if you, let's say I know somebody stole something, but they're not confessing, I don't have any witnesses. It's just me. Right? I saw this person, but I don't have any witnesses that this person stole something. And I know they took my thing. And even, let's say the judge interviews this person, and everybody really gets a strong sense that this person is guilty. You can then, but in a Sharia court, there's nothing you can do. The judge's hands are tied. If there's no witnesses against the person, then the person's oath that they're innocent carries the day. Then you can take them to an equity court and see if you can get justice there. Okay. I don't want to take too much longer, so I'll just actually, you know what, I think I'll skip to this. This is an interesting topic. I'm sorry to keep harping on analogies to American society legal system, but I think it's actually very useful. Very useful. One of the ways it's very useful is what Sharia means to Muslims. People like to, people like Bill Maher or Stan Harris or people who are Islamophobes in the U.S. love to tell people what Muslims believe, what the Sharia is. But you get a very different image when you ask Muslims what the Sharia means to them. And it's very similar to the Constitution of the United States. How many people here have actually read the entire Constitution? Wow. How many people here actually remember everything that was in the Constitution? How many people here think the Constitution is good? Wow, that's pathetic. You guys are really, I hope no one's videotaping this. So, okay, let's not imagine you all are, I don't know, you guys are all non-patriotic, forgive me. Let's go a normal patriotic room of Americans. How many of them are going to say they love the Constitution? All of them are going to say they love the Constitution, even though they haven't read it or they don't know what it's in. And actually, they might be people who really dislike the widespread ownership of guns in this country. They might have a big problem with the Second Amendment. But they're still going to say they like the Constitution. They're still going to say the Constitution is good. Because people don't necessarily have to think about all the details of what a document or what a system means when they tell you what they think it means to them. So if you look at Gallup, did some very interesting polling in 2000, I think between 2000 10, 2011, in 3 countries, in Egypt, Turkey, and Iran, majority Muslim countries. Now, one of the questions they asked is, do you think that the Sharia should be a source of law in your country? A source of law. 41% of people in Turkey said yes, it should be a source of law. In Iran, 63% said it should be a source of law. In Egypt, the number of people who said it should be a source of law was very small, but 64% said it should be the only source of law. So Egypt doesn't really match up with the others. Of these people, by the way, Gallup did another poll in 2006 in the United States. What percentage of Americans said that they thought the Bible should be a source of legislation in America? Anyone have a guess? 55%. 55%. So right smack in the middle of where the Muslims are on the question of Sharia. So this group of people who believe that Sharia should be a source of law, were then asked what they associate the Sharia with. 97% Egyptians, 76% of Iranians, 69% of Turks associated the Sharia with justice for women. 80% of people in Iran, of those people who answered positively to the Sharia as a source of law, 96% of people in Egypt, 63% of people in Turkey, also identified the Sharia as something that promotes a fair justice system. 77% of the people in Iran, 70% in Turkey, associated Sharia with reducing corruption. So if you were to ask a random American, get 10 Americans off the street, and you said, just do a word association. Sharia, they'd say camels. Sharia, hand getting chopped off. Sharia, stoning. Sharia, ISIS. Sharia, bad. Right? This is the exact opposite for the Muslims who are asked in these 3 countries. And remember, it doesn't really, we can have a big dispute about what the Sharia actually is in details, just as we can have a long dispute about what the Constitution actually says, what American law actually says. But none of that has anything to do with what it means to the people who identify it. And their identification, their feelings are important. They cannot be neglected. Just like Americans' views on the Constitution cannot be neglected. We would not accept someone coming in, another force coming into this country, and saying that our government needs to be changed because they don't like the meaning of the Constitution. If you see Bill Maher or Aina Hirsi Ali when they talk about, or Sam Harris when they talk about Muslims, one of the big issues that's come up lately, and this was started by Bill Maher and other new atheists, was the idea that ISIS is awful. Okay, I don't think we're going to dispute that. Okay? But that actually ISIS is not that different from regular Muslims, because if you look at what Muslims really believe, it's pretty close to ISIS. So that's the claim made by Bill Maher and others. For those of you who are interested in this, first I would recommend a book by my colleague John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed called Who Speaks for Islam? What 1 Billion Muslims Really Believe. Very, very useful book. But if you actually, the survey that Bill Maher and Aina Hirsi Ali love to quote is this 2013 Pew Forum for Religion and Thought, Pew survey about Muslim world attitudes. And I don't have Twitter because I have a huge mouth, and the last thing I should ever do is have Twitter. But I've been arguing with people about this for so long in various social media. It drives me crazy. I think people have just forgotten how to read. So here's this is one, this is very small for you. I couldn't figure out how to make it any bigger. But this is a question in the Pew survey. Percentage of Muslims who favor making Islamic law, Sharia, the official law of their country. You can see it tends to be pretty high in sub-Saharan Africa. 86% of people in Niger. In Iraq, 91%. Morocco, 83%. And it's very high in South Asia. So Afghanistan, 99%. Pakistan, 84%. Bangladesh, 82%. It's very low in the Balkan Muslim areas. So that's the first question. Do you think that Sharia should be the law of your land? Remember, that doesn't mean anything for what people really believe that would mean. Right? When somebody says, I love the Constitution, I want the Constitution to be the law of land, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't think of the Constitution as being something that allowed slavery, that denied votes for women until 1920, right? That continues to allow what I think is, I know this is Virginia, but it's some unacceptable percentage of gun ownership, amount of gun ownership in this country. They don't think about that. They think of what it means positively to them. Now, these are the statistics that people like Bill Maher and IAW love to cite. What they say is, look at the percentage of Muslims who believe that, let's say, if you leave Islam, the crime of apostasy, that this should be a death penalty offense. So, the one they cite all the time is 76% in Pakistan. I don't understand, and I've had this debate with so many people. What does it say under the top, the thing in bold? Can anyone read what it says under that? Yeah, so it's of the people who said yes to this question, the first one, of those people, then these percentage of those people say that, like 77% of people in Pakistan say that it should be death penalty offense. So if you look at Turkey, on the first question, Turkey, only 12% of the people asked said that the Sharia should be the law of the land. And then, in terms of the punishment for apostasy, 17% of those people asked in Turkey said that it should be death penalty offense. But if you take 17% of that 12%, it's only 2% of the original population surveyed. So this I don't know, I'm on like my own little mission on this. You people in this room, hear me, hear the words I say. Don't listen to these stupid statistics. You might still not like the percentage of people in Pakistan who say that apostasy should be a death penalty offense, but it's not the same as the percentage that is cited by people like Bill Maher and IAW. Finally, this is an interesting question from the Pew Research Center, which initially I thought it kind of contradicts that earlier question, because it said median percentage of Muslims in these regions who, on the right you see, say religious freedom is a good thing. 94% of Muslims in Sub-Saharan Africa, 93% in Southeast Asia, 95% in Southern and Southeastern Europe, 85% in Middle East and North Africa. 80% say that religion is a good thing. But I bring this up only because you have to be very, very careful. And you all are college students or related to a university, so you should be learning this. Be very careful when you're dealing with statistics, because what is the question that was actually asked? Muslims who say non-Muslims in their country are very free to practice their religion and consider this a good thing. So that is not the same as saying that they support freedom of religion. So initially I saw this contradicts the previous statistic, but I don't think it does. This statistic is also being spun. So I leave you with this advice, if I may. Treat Muslims as you treat any other group of people. Don't accept stupid generalizations about them. Treat Islam as you would treat any other world religion. It's diverse, it's vast, and it's defined by those people who practice it, not some tiny group of people that bothers you. Finally, always be aware of how statistics are used and how they're spun. That being said, I'm happy to answer questions if I can, or hear objections if you have them, or words of praise. Yeah, I've used you heavily. Ask the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown, for this wonderful presentation. I just had a few points to bring to the table, if you will. Just the issue of witnesses. The first one is the issue of witnesses. We spoke about adultery and prostitution and the issue of the confession and witnesses. In Islam, if, for the issue of adultery, you have to have 4 witnesses that testify that they saw the action. And if fewer than 4 witnesses testify, and they go to the judge and they say, we saw this, and we have fewer than 4 witnesses, then they are to be punished.
3 people are punished, or the 2 or the 1 are punished for slander. Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
But I want to say, and this is my, I think I'm the only one who's come up with this idea. I don't know if that's ever true ever in the world, but I'm the only one I've ever heard who's come up with this idea. I'm very proud of it. So in the Quran says you have to have 4 upstanding male witnesses who witness the act of fornication in order for the person to get convicted if they don't confess. Muslim scholars understood seeing the act to mean they actually have to see the jurist described the pen go into the inkwell, if you will. That's what they say. So you actually have to see that. That's very difficult to pull off. Now, but where is it not difficult? Come on, American males.
On TV?
Porn,
There you go.
right? I just did some of that day. But here's the thing. Okay, first of all, videotape can be doctored. So videotape is shubha, it's an ambiguity, so you can't take that in the Hudud case. But there's the people on the set. There's way more than 4 people working on the set. So they will all be witnesses. But in order to be accepted, you have to be an upstanding witness. And if you work on a porn set, you're by definition not an upstanding witness. So you would not have, by definition, no witness could testify to that case, and you couldn't prosecute, or you couldn't convict the couple accused. There's my shubha introduced on the That's actually it.
If you look at the number of witnesses in every other case other than adultery or fornication, there's a maximum, or there's a minimum of 2 witnesses. But since
Most of the time it's 2 witnesses. For anything like theft or killing or injury, you have to have 2 witnesses.
yeah, but scholars will tell you that for fornication or adultery, because you have 2 people committing the crime, you need 2 witnesses per person. So that's where the 4 comes in.
Okay. I never heard that, but it's a good one. Yes, thank you very much for that. And I got to showcase my explanation. Remember, Professor of the Cake.
Maria's fine. Well, first of all, I wanted to make you feel better and tell you there was class at 5:55.
You know, I've never abused people who left before, but I think I reached some, I just, it's been happening to me a lot lately, and I think I can get out. So apologize to those guys, I feel bad.
But one of them was my students, that's fine. But I wanted to actually say, with regard to the hudud, you mentioned that they didn't necessarily injure an individual person. But isn't it the case that jurists saw these kinds of crimes as having a high social cost? Right, so in other words, like, if people freely fornicated and committed adultery, lines of lineage and family structure and children's rights would essentially be harmed by this. Or if you had a society where people could steal with relative impunity, again, it wouldn't be a very,
Bad joke.
it wouldn't be a very secure kind of place. I mean, isn't there a sense also, specifically in how the jurists thought about this, that these were deeply harmful to society as a whole, even if not to a particular individual?
That's a very good point. I didn't, and I suppose I should be more clear about this, that I'm not saying that these things are not actually harmful, and I think that you're completely right. They didn't sit there and say, they thought, even if someone sits and gets drunk in their basement, there's still a huge harm that comes from that. No one is going to say there wasn't. What I was trying to stress is that if we think about harm in terms of really going out and clearly materially hurting another person, like hitting them or killing them or something like that. So that's a different, much more superficial or evident surface harm that we can measure and sense very easily, as opposed to like deeper social harms that might express themselves and manifest over a long period of time or in very subtle ways. What I was trying to stress is that hudud crimes, they're the most serious affronts in God's eyes, but they're not actually, that seriousness doesn't correspond 100% with what a human society would consider, metaphysical and deep social things aside, evident harms in that society.
Individualist society.
Yeah, especially individualist societies. Yes, good point. Bilal again. Wait, Yes, paper run, go ahead.
I'm sorry. If you look at the Hudud, just one more in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah Ta'ala says that the punishment for those who fight Allah and His Messenger and cause mischief in this world, in the world, is that they be killed or exiled. So it's a hadd, and in essence, it's because of the harm that they're causing to society, rather than just between them and God.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention all the Hudud crimes. I left out, I think, 2, because the 2 crimes were too complicated to get into in a short period of time. That's one of them. Head-on or ifsad, highway robbery or causing corruption and injustice in the land. Questions on this side? Yes, the young lady.
Thank you.
With the young man.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned the 2 witnesses, say in the case of like a Hudud theft. If you do have the 2 witnesses, then you do have to go with the full punishment?
No, because the confession of the thief is required.
So without the confession, I mean, if they say they didn't do it, but you have the 2 witnesses.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
It's not a. It doesn't mean that the thief walks away with the new iPod or whatever. Like, that was easy. No, it just means that the theft is not dealt with at the level of Hudud. It drops down into the Tazir crimes. Yes, gentlemen.
The question I have is about this distinction between the term sin and crime. It was in the good olden times when I was growing up, it was very easy to distinguish between the 2. Every crime, at least my parents told me, consider them as sins. But every sin may not be a crime. But in this, at this time, there are certain, for example, in some Western European countries, there are certain things which Muslim women are required to do, which are considered sins, but if they don't do it, it's considered a crime. So how are Muslim Jews,
Like, what's an
for
example?
example, removing hijab, for example, they are not allowed to, wear the hijab in public. So how do Muslim jurists deal with this situation where something which is considered a sin, if people don't, if try to abstain from it, it becomes a crime.
Yeah. So what happens if you are not permitted to do something that you're required to do, and it is not it doesn't involve another person. So you're not, I'm required to pay back a loan or something, but I'm not required to. This doesn't involve another person. We're talking about headscarf. So here the issue is not necessarily sin versus crime. The issue is what do Muslims do in situations when they are not allowed to practice their religion in the way that they are required to practice their religion. So when it comes to, let's say, women covering their face, only one Sunni school of law categorically requires women to cover their faces. The other schools of law either have one opinion saying it's required and one opinion saying it isn't. So it is required in Islamic law by consensus of Muslim scholars, at least classical Muslim scholars, that women cover their hair. So if you could say, if I'm not allowed to cover my face, I'm not allowed to meet the most stringent requirements of the religion, but I'm still within the realm of accepted disagreement. So in that case, a Muslim in France or in Netherlands or who's not allowed to cover their face, they can still live there if they wanted to. They're not being prevented from practicing their religion in things that are required them to do. If, however, you're not allowed to cover your hair, and then that's something that's required, and the majority argument of Muslims scholars throughout history was that Muslims cannot live in a place where they are prevented from practicing their religion. So, if, like the United States, I'm allowed to pray wherever I want. Okay? I'm allowed to take time to go over Friday to pray. Women are allowed to cover their hair. We'll see about this. At least you can see this. What's that crazy store with the naked people in the pictures? Abercrombie and Fitch. Right? When we'll see this case when it comes out about whether this woman was wronged in not being discriminated against and not being allowed to wear her hijab or being fired because of that. So the United States is a country where it's, generally Muslims are always going to be allowed to live because they're always going to be allowed to practice their religion. There was another opinion which was the most famous person who gave it is a scholar named al-Bukhari in the early, he died I think 1510 or 1511 in the Common Era. And it was a fatwa he gave to Muslims who were then at the time living under Christian rule in the conquered areas of Iberia, of Spain, that were conquered by Christians. And they were being forced to eat pork, forced to drink alcohol, forced to attend church. The majority opinion, and this was the majority of the most kind of what became the fatwas that won the day, is they have to leave. And eventually in 1525, the Spanish kingdom expelled, forced. So like we always talk about Jews being expelled from Spain in 1492. Many times more, thousands more Muslims were expelled from Iberia or tortured until they converted. So that never gets brought up. I don't know why this is the case. What Bahrani said, however, was no, it's more important for you to stay there and preserve some presence of Islam there, even if you are forced to consent. So just in your heart, you don't intend to do these things. The problem is that it doesn't work out. People can't keep, with a few exceptions in history, most religious communities cannot survive if they are forced to dissimulate completely. Eventually they will. Especially religion is kind of as public and as communal as Islam, it just doesn't survive. And sure enough, Muslims didn't survive in Iberia.
I think we had one question over here.
Yes. Saeed, oh, come on. This is a Georgetown student. What are you doing here?
Listen, your excellent ideas. If I didn't come, I would miss your point.
Thank you.
So I have a question. So Foucault talks about the birth of the prison in the European context, punishments, transforming from bodily punishments to the punishments like disciplinary punishments in a prison. How do you classify the punishments of Islam? Do you see any transition throughout the history, or bodily punishments? Prison doesn't make sense for the early modern era because you cannot keep people for so long, in confines.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because even in the United States, I mean, we have a prison population that's like the third highest in the world, or is it number one? I can't remember. Number one, like we execute the third most people. We imprison the largest prison population. If you don't have tremendous state resources to spend, or in our case, to give to fat, prison businessmen, it's really hard. It's a very, very difficult thing to put people in prison and maintain them. It takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, takes a lot of attention. So yes, prison was not generally by any pre-modern society the favorite form of punishment. It's too difficult. Muslims did have prisons even from the very early period, the early period of the Umayyad Caliphate, but they were generally used for political prisoners. Basically sending people. There was an island in the Red Sea off the coast of Egypt, actually, I think, which was an island where it still exists today. I think it's a resort town today. That was the place people were sent. Prison was more of a temporary thing that you would do to people during a trial. If somebody's, is accused of stealing something and they're going to make off with this thing unless you detain them until you can get the other people in court and have the trial, people were put in prison. People would be put into this little temporary prison if the judge thinks that they're not telling the truth, especially in that equity court, in the Balam court. They could be put in there until they, to cool their heels until they decide to tell the truth. But the most favorable forms of punishment were corporal punishment. There are two things: either a stern talking to and public humiliation, which in a highly individualistic society isn't that bad. If I go to Virginia traffic court and I get yelled at by the judge because I made a erratic lane change, which I apparently did once, then I get embarrassed in front of those people. I don't know any of these people. If I'm in my little town and I'm getting, raked over the coals by a judge in front of all these other people I know who are sitting around to listen, that's a really serious type of punishment. So then you would go up the ladder to corporal punishment. The general type was lashes, but especially the Ottomans loved bastinado, getting hit on the bottom of your feet with a reed. And it's a funny story. Last time I was here at Georgetown, I also told an embarrassing family story, but I'll tell it now. My mother, God rest her soul, she can't be prosecuted for this, but now, once we were in the closet, we were looking through a closet, we found this really kind of weird back scratching reed or something. My mom said, this looks just like a bastinado that the Ottomans love to use. And I said, I think I was about 10 or 11 years old. I said, that doesn't hurt. what is this thing? She said, okay, let me see your foot, I'll give you a try. And she whacked the bottom of my foot a few times, and it really hurt. It really hurt a lot. So bastinado is an effective form of punishment. Or other things like, I mentioned, being forced to do manual labor. In Ottoman Istanbul, after the night prayer, which nowadays is around, what, like 8 p.m., I can't remember exactly when it is, changing the time change. After that, there was curfew in the city. If you were caught out after that, you wouldn't get in trouble. You'd be forced to do labor, like carry stuff and carry firewood around until dawn. So there's always forms of punishment. One thing that were not really used are fines. You could be forced to pay money that you owed for damages, but to be kind of a punitive fine, this didn't really happen until the modern period. That's when Muslims start to adopt punitive measures from the West. Okay, yes.
Yeah, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the fact that I'm always hearing, the critics of Islam talk about how, apostasy in Islam is such a huge deal, they'll kill people for leaving Islam, which originally didn't make sense to me because, when I studied the life of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I found out that, there were certain individuals in that Meccan and Medina time period which they had accepted Islam and they later decided to leave Islam, and they were still able to live in peace. And God says in the Quran that, there is no compulsion in religion, and it's also very clear that, human beings, we have free will, He's given us logic and reason. He's allowed for us to choose and decide how we want to live our lives. So when I kind of looked deeper into the matter, what I kind of found, and I'm just basically seeking clarification from you on this matter, is that apostasy in Islam that's punishable by death is more or less, related historically to those individuals who may be, falsely converted to Islam with the intention of, during Islamic rule, trying to maybe, steal information from the Islamic, caliphate or the government, and then kind of, then later leaving Islam, only to go to the enemy and then disclosing that information, which, in today's society, if you go and do that, they call it treason, and that's still punishable by death, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think that you're on to something. I really wish I would get asked this question because it's taking me a while to answer. But the issue of apostasy is a very important issue. If you look at the ISIS group, what is it that allows ISIS to kill Muslims in Iraq and Syria or wherever? It's the fact that ISIS, unlike Sunni and Shia Islam, ISIS declares people unbelievers or apostates for committing crimes and doing things they don't agree with. Otherwise, in Sunni and Shia Islam, if you commit a crime or you commit a sin, you're just a bad person. You're still a Muslim. So it's the death penalty offense for apostasy that allows them to do this, that gives them the tool to justify Islamically their killing. The issue, and you're completely correct, when you look at the Quran, you see a very clear statement that there's la ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion of religion. And the problem arises when you look in the statements made by the Prophet, that are considered authentic by Muslim scholars, at least by Sunni scholars. One statement, man baddala dinahu faqtuluhu, whoever changes their religion, kill them. And another one that says, I'll just say that in English, the blood of a Muslim is not licit to shed except for three things. For someone who murders somebody and is punished by execution, for an adulterer, a married person who commits adultery, and a man taraka dinahu mufaraqan lil jama'ah, person who leaves their religion and forsakes the community, the Muslim community. These were taken by Muslim scholars almost in complete consensus, and it's very rare that Muslim scholars really come to complete consensus on something, but almost complete consensus that apostasy, leaving Islam, is a death penalty offense, based on those two statements of the Prophet primarily. But what's interesting is if you look at the second statement, you get an insight into what you're saying, which is it's not someone who leaves their religion as a Muslim, it's someone who leaves their religion and forsakes the Muslim community. And the key here, and the reason also why Muslim scholars so conclusively and as a body came to this conclusion about the death penalty offense for apostasy, is because of the nature of their community, the nature of how they understood identity. And this is not just the case for Muslims, this is the case for Christians and Jews, also in the pre-nation-state period. Before people's primary identity and primary loyalty was defined by a nation-state, a territorial
territory or area filled with people who were all French or Dutch or whatever, or American, before that became our primary way of identifying ourselves, and also the primary state unit which considered our obedience and our loyalty to be required, before that it was loyalty to your religious community. Whether it's Latin Christendom, or whether it's the Ummah, the Muslim community in the case of Islamic civilization. So that was your community, that was your nation. And to leave it was to upset the order of the world that these scholars understood. And it was understood by the rulers and people in their societies. They didn't care about people's personal conscience. If somebody didn't believe in Islam, if somebody sat and drank alcohol, and a lot of Muslim rulers drank in carouse and murdered people with impunity. They didn't care what people believed on the inside. What they cared was their outward obedience to this overall confessional order. So what happens in really the late 19th century, but it really starts gaining momentum in the early 20th century, is Muslim scholars who see themselves now in a world of nation states start to rethink the crime of apostasy and the issue of apostasy, because it doesn't make sense if it's no longer being Muslim that's important, but being Egyptian. Why does it really matter if you're an Egyptian Muslim or an Egyptian Christian? Right? It doesn't really matter anymore. It doesn't have any. There's no clear formal political problem. So what they do exactly what you identified. They say, look, this is not about religion. This apostasy isn't a matter of someone changing religion as a matter of personal conscience. It's about someone going out and really upsetting the political order of their time. So scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the Egyptian mufti who lives in Qatar, he divides, and this is representative of a whole big trend in Muslim scholars, divides apostasy into what's called Ridda al-Kubra or Ridda al-Sughra. Ridda al-Ta'adidiyya or Ridda ghayr al-Ta'adidiyya, which is, the first one is public transgressory, or apostasy that is publicly transgressive, and apostasy that is not publicly transgressive. If you just privately happen to not convert to Christianity, and you just go about your life as a Christian, no one cares. But if you go out and say, have a big sign saying, oh, Muslims need to all abandon their religion, Islam's a terrible religion, it's a horrible way to live, etc., then he would consider this to be precisely that apostasy that does require serious punishment. Oh wait, hang on. Young lady was, I want to be equitable to my female audience. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, first of all.
All.
I wanted to ask about madhabs, school of thought, and is it necessary to pick one to follow, or can you just go with the majority opinion of scholars in general from different schools as well?
Or you're not going to go easy on the non-specialist audience here, I see. So the question is, to what extent a Muslim has to follow one specific school of law. The answer to the question is that there are several answers. But one approach, you can see this one answer tends to be found in the Hanafis of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman heartland, and South Asia, which is you follow one madhab, and not only that, but you follow the main principal opinion of that madhab, unless necessity forces you to leave the main rule of that madhab for another madhab. And really, really bad necessity, if you don't tell anyone about this, you can go to another school of law. They don't like to talk about that. The opposite end of the spectrum is kind of like, look, these are all legitimate opinions in the Islamic tradition. Your intention is what's important. God is going to punish you or reward you based on your intention. So if you want to go out and put together like a Mr. Potato Head made of all little easy rulings, that's fine. These are all allowed. But you know, God is going to judge you. And these aren't things that are happening in front of a court. So you're not wronging other people. This is your own life you're leading. The middle answer, or the middle ground, is that you should stick with one madhab unless either you believe that there's evidence that another school of law's opinion is stronger, or there's some need in your life, or justifying need that would make it allowed for you to take another ruling. So, for example, in the 3 of the 4 Sunni schools of law, if a dog comes up and drools on you and licks you and grabs your hand like my neighbor's dog does all the freaking time, My pants, I can't pray in my pants, I have to wash my pants several times, I gotta wash my hands several times, okay? That's a big pain. In the Maliki school of law, one of the Sunni schools, dogs are ritually clean. So a dog goes up, drools on my pants, drools on my hand, that's no big deal. In this case, in the context of American suburban life or even urban life, we have dogs everywhere, and Muslims don't want to go like running around, the dogs chasing them all the time, then it would make sense to take the Maliki ruling in this case. But on conditions, you can't make, remember we talked about the Mr. Potato Head? You can't make a Mr. Potato Head that self-negates. So you can't make a Mr. Potato Head that no one would accept. So let's say in the Maliki school, a dog comes up and licks my hand. Okay, but I'm taking the Maliki ruling on that. Now I go into, then I go into I go out on the street and I step on cat poo. Step in cat poo. Now other schools of law would call this is ritually unclean. In the Hanbali school of law, however, it's not ritually unclean. So I'm going to take the Hanbali ruling here. And then I go and I do my prayers, and because I don't want to, my hair is looking really good that day, so I do my ritual pure. I don't want to white my whole head like the Maliki school requires. I take the Shafi ruling where I only have to white part of my head. So now, if I pray, I'm ritually pure according to the Malikis on one thing, ritually pure according to the Hanbalis on the other thing, but ritually impure according to the Malikis. I've wiped my head according to the Shafi school, and I haven't met the Maliki requirements for the head wiping. So I have this Frankenstein monster that no one, as a composite, no one would accept. That you're not allowed to do. But I would also say it's easy to pick a madhab just for issues of praying and fasting. It just gives you what to do. If you make a mistake in prayer, you just follow that madhab's rule about what you do. It's easier than trying to cobble together your own version of stuff.
Thank you.
So like this guy here, he was up and then I distant for the...
No problem. Thank you very much. So you were giving the example earlier of how out in the island people would eat food from the water beside fish due to necessity of living in an island. So my question is, what helped Muslims and Muslim scholars to distinguish between those behaviors that they can change due to necessity or local culture and those behaviors that they can't?
That's actually a super, super good question. Like where do you draw the line between the things that, like drinking alcohol, not allowed to ever change, and things that you can change? There are two factors, I think. This is my own analysis. There are two factors. One is, to what extent are these things subject to disagreement? So if there's a high degree of scholarly derivation, if the textual sources, the Quran and the statements of the Prophet aren't really clear, if there's ambiguity or a lot of room for disagreement, or people disagree on whether a certain statement of the Prophet is authentic or not, then you have kind of a room created for allowable disagreement. And within that disagreement, then you know you're within the range, you're within the pale of acceptable opinion. So I couldn't come and declare what you're doing to be totally unacceptable in Islam, because actually it's not totally unacceptable. It's unacceptable for certain people. I could, if you made this Frankenstein monster that I'm talking about, then we would all reject that. But an individual ruling that other people disagree with, they can't object to. The second thing is, it also depends on the kind of origin of that ruling. So, by the way, the rule about fish in the Hanafi school is based precisely on one kind of idiosyncratic interpretation of Quranic verses and acceptance of hadiths that other Sunnis don't accept. The second thing is to what extent the Prophet in his rulings, he created exceptions for rules. So some of his rules are actually exceptions to other rules. So in general, Muslims cannot buy and sell things that don't exist yet. So this certainly applies to like futures and derivatives and things like that. But it also applies to things like, let's say I want to sell you the fruit of this tree. When this fruit becomes ripe, I will sell them to you. We don't know what they're going to be. Are they going to get destroyed by a storm? Is it going to be a bad year? Is there not going to be enough water? Is it just a fluke and it's not going to produce as many dates as I think it is? So you can't buy and sell things that don't exist. However, you can buy and sell things that don't exist if it's necessary for crop production. Let's say I'm a farmer. I only get money when I have my crop come in. I need to pay people and buy things and feed my family the rest of the year. So the Prophet allows what's called sadam, where I basically go and I buy seed from you and get a loan from you and buy clothes from you and a donkey from you, and I will pay you that amount when my crop comes in. It's basically a purchase on credit. Now, I've sold something that doesn't really exist yet, but this isn't necessary. So that becomes then, that creates an exception for things like orders for factory goods. Or let's say I order a shirt from a shirt store, and they make that shirt custom for me, but they charge my credit card when I buy the thing. In theory, I've bought something that doesn't exist yet, but in the United States, we all know if they send me a shirt that I don't like, or they don't send me the shirt, I have means to recoup my money very easily. And so this is accepted in the culture. That's a similar, that starts fitting under this exception that's already been created. So a lot of the things that are, let's say, breaking away from a well-established rule based on local custom, do so because there's already been exceptions created by the Prophet or early jurists to that overall rule. Am I allowed to keep going?
Okay, actually we're just going to do one more question for the sake of time. We have this space reserved until 7 o'clock. And I believe this gentleman here wanted to ask a question.
Yes, sorry. I'll talk to you after. Yes, go ahead, gentleman in the back.
I just had a question when it comes to marriage.
Pick the right lady.
Inshallah, of course. And when you were to go speak to her father, how necessary is it for him to request a dowry if he chooses to waive that right? Well, because I know that.
So I'm not a mufti, so I'm not going to answer your question, but I will analyze your question. Which is, this is an interesting. In Muslim marriage, basically, I've mentioned this before, but the groom gives dower, money to the bride. Now, since the 1000s is the common era, but it really becomes common in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, what you Muslims would do, and actually you see the same thing with Jews living in Islamic civilization, is you pay an upfront dower and then a back-end dower. So the back-end dower you only pay if you divorce your wife without cause. So let's say you just say one day, I'm sick of you. I'm out of here. Then you have to pay the back-end dower. And what happens is the back-end dower starts becoming quite massive, because it allows the family of the girl and the girl to request a very high price or put a high value on her. And this has a lot to do with social standing. And yet the husband doesn't bankrupt himself when he's getting married. And it's also a guarantee that he's not just going to divorce her willy-nilly. Right? But here's the problem. A lot of people talk about Islamic divorce law is unfair to women. I actually think one could make a better argument that it's unfair to men. I'll tell you why. A wife has lots of options out of marriage. She can, the most common way of marriage is, and based on our court records in the medieval period, is the woman would do what's called a khula. She would basically either negotiate her way out of the marriage with her husband. She'd say, I relinquish my right to the dower. You don't have to pay my maintenance. I'm not here. Or if the husband doesn't want this, she goes to the judge and says, I want to do this. She can also go to the judge and say, my husband's mistreating me, my husband's cruel to me, my husband's not doing this, he's not doing that, he's not fulfilling his obligations, he's hurting me, he's doing whatever. And then the judge can do what's called tafriq, which is judicial separation. You can actually just terminate the marriage. She gets her dowry money, she gets her maintenance payments, and she leaves. The husband, if he divorces the wife unilaterally, which is the kind of, it's called talaq, it's the thing that people always talk about in the media about Muslim, bad Muslim divorce law. He can do that without he can do it unilaterally. He can do it in 5 seconds. But he has to pay the back end dower, which is going to be, like for me, if I had to pay my back end dower, I would bankrupt myself. I don't have that much money. Okay? So, I'm actually kind of stuck in this situation. My wife can keep, hitting me on the head and kicking me and, making fun of me all the time and things like that. And I'd say, I can't get out of this. I have to pay the back. I'm not going to lose all my money, et cetera, et cetera. What's the husband's option? He also can go to the judge and ask for a judicial separation based on the fact that my wife is hitting me and making fun of me and kicking me and things like that. So in the end, the two end up with kind of the same option, best option for their own interest. The reason I'm bringing this up is because my advice to you, as a fellow person, is if somebody makes an outrageous demand of you financially for the front-end dowry, then let me tell you this. It's very important to get along with your in-laws. It's very important. It's very, very important. Even if you don't have a lot to do with them. If your wife's not happy with her family, if her family isn't happy with her, you're going to suffer, your marriage is going to suffer. So if someone's putting that bar up to you, what they're basically saying is, we don't want you. And when I was younger, I would have gotten all upset about that. It's, this isn't right, things like that. But as an older person, I think I would just say, okay, no, I'm not going to put myself in this situation. If they put a very high back-end dower, that's pretty standard, and it doesn't mean that they don't like you. It's them valuing their daughter, and the daughter valuing herself. Then you just have to ask yourself, what happens if the thing is, if you're living in like a Muslim country, then you usually have to pay the back-end dower. But if you're living in the United States, then you could try to say that when you go to divorce court, or family law court, that this is a religious thing, you're not bound by it. I'm not advocating that, but I think it's dishonest. But there's lots of cases in the United States where the issue of dowry payment, back-end dowry payment comes up in divorce settlements. And you see what ends up happening is, sometimes American courts will make the guy pay, sometimes they won't. They'll say it's just a religious thing, it's not a real contract. But you see that the parties end up, if the Islamic argument is in their interest, they use it. If the Islamic argument is against their interest, they try to get out of it. So people are kind of creatures of interest wherever they are. Thanks a lot, everybody. Enjoy the food.